You're not that nervous, are you?
No, this is for science.
Who was that? You're hired. All right, where's there? I guess that's the official reminder. All right, good afternoon. Wow, this is a great turnout. Thank you all for coming to what is the Renwick's 40th anniversary symposium, nation building, because we're all building things for this country, right? I am delighted that we're doing this today. As I think you already know, this is in conjunction with 40 Under 40 Craft Futures, which is our 40th anniversary exhibition, which is at the Renwick. Please go see it if you haven't already. It is up until February 3rd, so you have plenty of time to get over there still. And what we wanted to do with our 40th anniversary was to have a serious conversation, also a fun conversation, but one with some real substance, one with some real content about where American craft is going. If you'll forgive me the use this week of an electoral college analogy, we wanted to expand the map, as it were, to take over some new ground and to show people that craft is something that is really evident in all walks of American life. What I think you'll see from this program is that that is in fact the case. I think that you will see that there are speakers and subjects here that you did not, I'm hoping that you did not expect to see. You may not agree with everything you hear today or tomorrow, and that is a good thing. We're here to have a conversation. And I expect that given the folks I see in the audience right now and the folks that will be up here over the next couple of days, that we will have some very good dialogue. So please do talk amongst yourselves. I do have some business to take care of here. First of all, cell phones, please make them quiet. Nobody wants to be the person that has the phone go off during the middle of an important talk. I should also note that up until recently, up until like last week, we had terrible reception in this auditorium. It has just been wired for Wi-Fi. So if you feel compelled to tweet all about this program or to live blog it or something and tell the world that we're doing extraordinary things at the Smithsonian, I will forgive that. Also, there is a shop table just outside in the lobby here. You'll see we're selling 40 under 40 catalogs. We're also selling 40 under 40 posters, which are hand silk screened by Little Friends of Printmaking in Milwaukee. So those are a very limited edition. I encourage you to pick those up. They are also both for sale in the shop upstairs in the main floor. We are live webcasting this. Please do not do anything illegal in the auditorium. It will be archived permanently. So not only can people see this remotely today, but we will be archiving this, putting it up on the website. You can watch this into eternity if you want. I think it'll be a great resource. I should also mention on that note that because we're old-fashioned as well, that we will be publishing the proceedings of the symposium in print next year. Very excited about that. And in fact, we just also received a grant to help us with that from the Center for Craft, Creativity, and Design in North Carolina. So thank you very much. And on that note, I'd also like to thank my profound thanks to the Smithsonian Women's Committee. In fact, the only reason we're able to do this today, and in fact that we can afford to do this, is because of the Women's Committee here at the Smithsonian. They have endowed a lecture series in American craft, and in fact, that is covering all of our costs for the next 2 days. So thank you. And I did want to mention micro donations. As some of you know already, some of you may not be familiar with, it is our goal still to acquire at least one work by every artist in 40 under 40 for the Renwick's permanent collection. We are 3/4 of the way towards that goal already. We are still looking to acquire some of the works in the show, and we have a micro donation campaign on for that right now. If you go to our website, you will see it's very easy to do. You can do it by phone and so on. Finally, in terms of how we're doing questions and answers here, you will see from the program that we are divided up into sessions. We are doing a Q&A for each session, not for each speaker. So after the end of a session, I'll ask all of the speakers for that session to come up to sit at the table here, and we'll get underway. Because we have a lot to cover, I'm not going to introduce individual speakers. You've got a program here with little bios for everybody. You can read all about them. But we really just do want to get underway and give the stage away to the people that you came here to see. So on that note, Mr. Glenn Adamson, one of, I would say, or perhaps arguably, one of the best thinkers, speakers in American craft and craft internationally in design, currently the head of research at the Victoria and Albert in London. It doesn't seem like I can ever turn around without seeing a new book, a new article, a new blog, something by Glenn, and each time I'm left enlightened. So we are absolutely thrilled that he agreed to come and give a keynote today. It means a lot to us that he came across an ocean to share some thoughts with you. So Glenn, please get on up here.
Thank you very much, Nicholas, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you today. And I also want to thank Katie here to my right, who's done so much to make us all feel welcome and get us all organized. And also say thank you to Sabrina Geschwantner, who I don't think is here, but perhaps is looking online, who told me that I had to give this talk. So what I'm about to do for you is easily the most personal talk I've given in my career, and probably the most important. So I hope you like it. So I turned 40 this year, just like the Renwick. And so I'm going to begin by exercising my right as the keynote speaker to make a joke before anyone else has a chance to, which is that technically I shouldn't be here at all, as I am 40. So apparently I've been grandfathered in by Nicholas as an elder statesman. So thank you for dragging these old bones before you. And also I'd like to congratulate Nicholas and his team here at the Renwick on the show. Now you can probably count the number of truly brilliant craft surveys that have happened in America since the Second World War on the fingers of one hand. I may have forgotten something, but what I could come up with was Designer Craftsman USA back in 1953, originated at the Brooklyn Museum, Objects USA in 1969, which kicked off just down the street here in Washington, attracting record numbers back then, and then went on to tour to 20 American and 10 European venues. In 1986, Poetry of the Physical, which despite its landmark status was, like every exhibition at the Old American Craft Museum, principally made up of the staircase, as you can see, but also was absolutely seminal in defining the moment of the 1980s. Then a little earlier, though it's specific to one state, you'd probably have to make a place for the long-running California Design series, especially the editions curated by Eudora Moore from 1962 to 1976. So that's 4, and now we've finally gotten to the thumb, 40 under 40, this charismatic assemblage that you see here, many of you in the room. And I think it's a show, I just saw it for the first time this morning, and I think it's a show that has both brains and guts, which is not something you can say about most exhibitions of any kind, much less in the crafts area. So well done to everyone who has had a role in the undertaking, and I think a round of applause is in order for Nicholas and his team. Thumbs up. Now, as I was saying, I turned 40 earlier this year in August, a crossroads in anyone's life. And I suppose for me, it's been a moment to think about where I've been and also where I'm going. And so that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. Where I've been, well, when the Renwick and I were both born in 1972, studio craft was at the height of its powers. As I mentioned, Objects USA, the most successful post-war craft exhibition, was touring the world. Also, in other quarters, universities were opening rather than closing medium-specific courses on ceramics, glass, metal, textiles, and woodworking. Across the waters in Britain, my adopted home, there was a brand new crafts council, which had been founded the previous year in 1971, initially with very homespun tastes, as you could see here. That would change. My own present employer, the Victoria and Albert Museum, was at work on an exhibition called The Craftsman's Art, which would open the next year in 1973. So things were good. Little did I know, growing up over the next few years, that I was living through a period of decline. I may have looked cheerful enough, despite the hideous prevailing fashions, exacerbated by my parents' love for hand-me-downs from the neighbors. But all around me, craft was acquiring a dubious double reputation for hippie idealism on the one hand and forthright commercialism on the other. Two countervailing tendencies to excess that would not necessarily age well. Now, this is not the story that I propose to recount to you today. Many of you will remember it. But suffice to say that the popular enthusiasm and integrity and relevance that craft had enjoyed in the 1960s and 70s did not survive the harsher climate of the 80s. It was a time in art for theory and the anti-aesthetic, which back then seemed antithetical to the values of craft. We might think differently about that, seeing 40 under 40. Meanwhile, design was embarking on the thrill ride of postmodernism, a subject I know something about, having curated a show about it at the V&A last year. Postmodernism is very interesting from a craft history perspective because, in fact, most of the objects associated with the movement were, in fact, handmade, like this chair designed for Memphis by Peter Shire, the Los Angeles-based ceramist, designer, furniture designer, and sculptor. So they were handmade, but they did nothing to celebrate the fact. Rather, they were calculated for the effect that they would make when mass-produced, not in 3 dimensions, but rather on the pages of glossy magazines, or for that matter in slide lecture presentations. And I can tell you that this chair looks a hell of a lot better here than it did in the V&A on the platform. And that's entirely intentional. So these were props meant for styling, effectively. They were, if you like, props in a theater of postmodern fragmentation and performing themselves. Now, I wasn't nearly hip enough at 20 to have my own postmodern turn, but I certainly did get the drift that craft was not the in thing. And I'd formed a firm opinion by that age, half my present age, that craft was something I didn't need to take too seriously. Now, I have a little archival find to share with you. This is something I discovered in a sort of back closet in my childhood home. My parents still live there, earlier this year, and this is me at 20 talking about craft. It's a local access cable TV show, and I think the reason they interviewed me was because I also have a twin brother, and they thought that was noteworthy. But this was what passed for excitement in Stoneham, Massachusetts in 1992. But you'll see a quick shot of him as well as the interviewer, Anna Maria Arsenault.
Volunteer work at the museum at Harvard for German art. And I also do some volunteer work at a crafts gallery that I've been working at since the beginning of the summer. And I also, this is interesting, I worked at a museum in Brockton, way south of Boston, the Fleur Museum. And it was really interesting to work there. They're a sort of impoverished museum with no permanent collection to speak of, no money really, and a sort of minimal staff because they can't afford to pay staff. And so they're trying to somehow get by on all these things. And it was really interesting to work there. That was the first museum I'd ever worked in. And they had so many problems. I mean, it's amazing.
I've been to that museum.
Really?
Yeah.
It's a wonderful place. It's
the facility in the building and the land surrounding it, it is.
But they have almost nothing to put in it.
Exactly.
And
it's almost like, at least my first impression was it was almost like a craft show.
I think the reason that they do that is because you can easily arrange a craft show, and it's cheap, and you don't have to pay the artist for the right to hang the picture on the wall. Whereas if you were hanging really important art, you have to actually get the art from the artist. Whereas a craft show, you can just use any local craft, not any. And actually, I'm going to be hopefully helping arrange a glass craft exhibit there next summer. So I don't know if that'll pan out or not, but I know they're bidding one, so it's going to be a crafts fair again. But you know, it's interesting, and I think that usually museums aren't very crafts oriented, and it's not. I don't think necessarily a bad thing when they are, because you know you have huge museums like the Museum of Fine Art, Metropolitan in New York, and there's so much art in those museums that you know that they're not going to be showing a lot of crafts, so you might as well, in the other museums, you might as well show.
So that's it.
Yeah. Okay, so little did I know then that, in fact, the Fuller Museum would eventually become a full-time craft museum, and what's more, that I would be very pleased when it did, and it's thrived since in that capacity. I also didn't suspect then that I would go on to work in a craft store in Brooklyn, the Clay Pot, former hippie emporium turned purveyor of handmade wedding rings and Christmas gifts. You can see here that I'm sporting a short-lived, as it turned out, and possibly ill-advised beard. And then I went to graduate school at Yale University, where I started studying the subject in earnest, going so far as to try my hands at various crafts, as you can see here. Less and less hair all the time, you'll notice, leading to today. But let me go back a few years to 1992, when that interview was taken. As you could tell, I had no notion that I was about to become a specialist in craft, but that was about to change just a few months later, in fact, thanks in part to this dish. As an undergraduate, I had decided to take a course on the history of Chinese ceramics, not for any particularly good reason. As I remember it, I was commuting to campus, and I just wanted to fit my courses into as tight a schedule as possible. Professor Maury's History of Chinese Pottery and Porcelain happened to fit between two other now forgotten lectures, and so I signed up. And because other students lacked my peculiar motivation, it was not a heavily subscribed class, so only 12 of us were seated around a seminar table on a Tuesday morning for the first handling session. So there I was, sitting in a quiet room holding this Tang Dynasty dish about a millennium old. To be honest, I don't really recall the specifics of what I was meant to be learning, apart from a bit of technical information about the colors, so cobalt makes the blue, iron the brown, lead for green, that kind of thing. But what has stayed with me is the physical force of the thing. Its age, its delicacy, its sheer alienness hit me like a ton of bricks, as did the electric sense of connection to a remote time, place, and person, the person that made it. And this is what Edmund Duval calls the synapse that connects one hand to another across the centuries through the mediating energies of a handmade object. And frankly, there was no comparison to the other art historical experiences I'd had, sitting in darkened lecture halls in those pre-PowerPoint days, watching the slides flick by. The dish was there, it was palpable. No amount of talking about it seemed to use it up or even to approach an adequate explanation of it. And my career since has been in some ways an attempt to live up to that moment of attraction, and in some ways an attempt to get over it, or at least to put it into context. My book Thinking Through Craft, for example, which I published in 2007, does have a few asides about the pleasures of pots and other skillfully made things. For example, in the conclusion, I mentioned how important it was to me, personally, even psychologically, that I could sit in this chair made by the Bay Area furniture maker Art Carpenter, his real name, Art Carpenter in 1969, as I wrote the book. But for the most part, Thinking Through Craft treats its subject as an intellectual chess piece, showing how artists have used craft as a horizon which they could not cross, and therefore against which they could define their own ambitions. So it is definitely a book written by someone who thought that craft was a subordinate term, and was destined also to remain so. How else would I have come round to the key argument of the book? Now, what did Nicholas say about that? How else would I have come round to the key argument in the book that craft's inferiority is the most productive thing about it? When making this case, I perhaps drew again on my childhood. Not any particular experience I'd have of craft back then, although I did make the odd Christmas ornament at school. This present for my parents that I made at the age of 5, I think is the earliest extant work in the field that I've made. But my house was really a strictly Tupperware-only zone, so it wasn't that I was surrounded by craft by any means. I was surrounded by mass-produced suburbia, but I think of certain values that were instilled in me back then nonetheless. For example, by the Charlie Brown Christmas special, based on Charles Schulz's beloved Peanuts characters. How many of you have seen the Charlie Brown Christmas special? That's what I thought. So it first aired on television in 1965, but it was still in annual repeats when I was growing up. And December never passed without me sitting down to watch it again. So you'll remember the story, but here's a quick summary anyway. Charlie Brown is hired on as the director of the school holiday pageant, and he proves to be completely useless at this, largely as the other children seem to be unswervingly committed to new wave dance. So the kids send him off to get a tree. And they say to him, "A big, shiny aluminum Christmas tree, do something right for a change." But when he and his little friend Linus get to the tree farm with its bright lights and neon colors, it's not one of the garish new trees that speaks to him, but rather a spindly little pine with a few pathetic bristles of needles. And he turns to Linus and says, "I think it needs me." We might well speculate on Charlie Brown's psychological motivations at this point, but let's just say that when he returns to show the other children the humble tree he's found, he is roundly mocked, and he's anguished. Charlie Brown exits, stage left, cloaked in shame. But then, as you'll probably remember, Linus delivers a speech from the Bible about the true meaning of Christmas. The other children, newly infused with the spirit of the holiday, gather round. In a single magical moment of tree trimming, the sad little stick becomes lush green and resplendent. Charlie Brown returns. He is stunned at the transformation. The children wish him a Merry Christmas and break into song as the credits roll. Now, in this little story, I find an allegory of how I feel about craft. And I suspect a lot of people in the room could tell a similar story. When we started caring about it, we thought it needed us. Back in the 90s, craft did seem a neglected object, underloved, languishing in the corner of our various disciplines of art, design, making, art history, theory. Now we've woken up to a surprising reality. Craft has become, as Schultz might have put it back in the 1960s, real in. The transformation has been exciting, but disorienting too, especially if, like me, you are originally motivated by a sense of injustice. When knitters and potters and weavers were treated as second-class citizens, their work beneath the notice of the art and design worlds, and the makers themselves dismissed as either hippie throwbacks or wannabe real artists, it made sense to champion their cause. But now we face a different set of questions about the appropriateness of appropriating craft skills, often in a manner that radically decontextualizes them, or conversely, about the merits of work that claims the values of care and authentic expression that we associate with craft, but none of its technical excellence, a trend that I've described as sloppy craft, borrowing a phrase from Ann Wilson and Josh Fott, who will be the subject of Elisa's remarks later on. Or is it a publication, Elisa? Are you talking about Josh Fott? Yeah, you are, good, okay. So here I'm using the ceramic work of Arlene Shechet as an exemplar. Now these are interesting questions about skill, about appropriation, and they become more interesting and more pressing when craft is receiving so much attention from so many quarters, when art galleries and museums host groundbreaking shows on ceramics. Here, the exhibition Dirt on Delight at the ICA in Philadelphia, which I consulted on and which included Shechet's work, as you can see here. When designers retreat to the woods to commune with pole lathe turners, for example, as a project led by Designers Block recently did in Britain, and then exhibit the results at the Milan Furniture Fair. Here, the work of Gareth Neal, attracting the attention of the design press. When corporations use the rhetoric of craft to sell everything from shoes to sandwiches to cheese to makeup to Jeep Wagoneers. When my own museum, the V&A, finally gets around to doing another major exhibition about craft. You'll remember the last one is in 1973. Well, we just hosted a show called Power of Making that drew 315,000 people, which was the second highest attendance figure in recent institutional history. Also, when politicians embrace craft, and here I have another video for you. This is the UK former Minister of Skills, whose name is John Hayes, weirdly appropriating the language of the dyed-in-the-wool socialist William Morris.
Practical skills matter. They matter to our economy, where shortages of craft skills, of technical skills, will hold back our businesses unless we address them. They matter to individuals, those individuals whose aptitudes, whose tastes and talents take them down the vocational route, the practical route, rather than the academic one. And they matter to communities too. All communities need that variety of talents, that variety of skills, which people who have pursued a vocational route and then achieve the best they can be bring.
So I think what's very interesting there is that you can feel an undercurrent of a very long-standing set of class divisions being reinstated under the rhetoric of craft being good for you. And those of you who are interested, I would say it's well worth checking out his entire text, John Hayes is his name, online, because it's a fascinating example of how the rhetoric of craft can swing from left to right, politically speaking, with you scarcely noticing. Now, the mass media is also scrambling to have its own part in this turn to the crafts. And once more, I can speak from experience, having been put in front of the cameras again, this time to be a judge on a reality television show, which is entitled Paul Martin's Handmade Revolution. The program was shot this summer, and it just aired in October, unfortunately not shown here in the United States. It has a simple premise. Amateur craftspeople are invited to bring in an object they have made to be assessed by a panel of experts. The format's loosely adapted from the Antiques Roadshow, or Flog It, the British version. My job as head judge, suit by Carol McNichol, by the way, was to lead a panel of 3 alongside Piyush, there on the left, who is a sharp-tongued textile entrepreneur, sort of our answer to Simon Cowell. And then in the middle, Mary Jane, who is a sweet-tempered milliner, ever ready with a helpful suggestion for improvement. The job of the presenter, Paul Martin, seemed to be to emit as much enthusiasm as he possibly could. And he would look up into the sky as the camera swooped above him, praising the handmade as an antidote to the deadness of mass production, and also exhorting the audience to rediscover traditional skills before they disappeared forever. And this is one last clip I'm going to play for you.
And action.
We're living in a disposable culture where we buy, use and bin virtually everything. And to quote Oscar Wilde, we know the price of everything and the value of nothing. Another prominent Victorian, William Morris, urged us to have nothing in our homes that we do not know to be useful or believe to be beautiful. And like him, I want to champion Britain's heritage. So come on, join me, Paul Martin, in my handmade revolution! Yay!
Hooray. So for a historian like myself, participating in this show was an oddly familiar but also radically decontextualizing experience. In its atmosphere and intentions, the show conforms to the broad outlines of contemporary reality television. And despite the incendiary term revolution in the program's title, it is a gentle and almost entirely apolitical affair, reminiscent for me of the puzzlingly harmless phenomenon of guerrilla knitting. So the atmosphere on the program is light and joyful. It focuses on personal development rather than social change. All finalists, regardless of their skill level, and we were instructed to do this, were to be congratulated for their dedication and passion, which is the word that was perhaps most commonly heard on the show. And so the message was that craft is a non-competitive activity. This is perhaps most explicitly telegraphed by the fact that there were no winners on the show, only judges' favorites. Yet, despite this fundamentally life-affirming core message, the program is staged against a rhetorical backdrop of cultural crisis. So Paul Martin's introduction there, as you may have noticed, had many historical echoes, ranging from Oscar Wilde to Gropius's proclamation in the Bauhaus Manifesto, which you'll remember begins, "Architects and designers, we must all return to the crafts," to, again, the writings of William Morris, who's a seemingly ever-present point of reference at the moment. Seeking precedents for the show, you could go back even further to John Ruskin, Henry David Thoreau, his book Walden, Thomas Carlyle, his book Signs of the Times. All of these Victorian thinkers outlined the need for a reinvestment in craft and self-sufficiency in order to counter the dehumanizing effects of industry. Now, in my next book, there are the three gents, and in my next book called The Invention of Craft, which should be out in February, I track this idea that craft is disappearing, and I try to show just how venerable that tradition is. In other words, the tradition of thinking that tradition is going away. In fact, I have come to the conclusion that craft, in its modern sense, was invented as a point of departure, as an old thing, passing inevitably into history, against which new industry could define itself. But until that oppositional structure came about, there was, in a very important sense, there was no craft, not in the way that we use the word today, not in the sense of a defined territory. The only way to make anything was by hand, after all, so what would you define craft against? What else would there be? And this brings me at last to my real theme today, which is that of a long goodbye. In my lecture so far, I have been tracing an autobiographical passage from certainty to uncertainty, from the pleasures of the single object to the forbidding complexities of transdisciplinarity. I have used my own experience as a representative example of this shift, but I'm pretty sure that it's not just me, and I can say this with some confidence because around the same time that I was finishing Thinking Through Craft, I began co-editing this journal, the Journal of Modern Craft, together with Tanya Harrod and Ned Cook. Now, this has been a real education, much more of an education than graduate school ever was. And one of the reasons is because of many of you in this room who have contributed to its pages, from whom I've learned a great deal. It would be impossible to summarize the contents of the journal, which comes out 3 times a year. It offers a plethora of arguments, theories, and case studies in each issue. But if I were to generalize, I would say that almost all of our authors tend to seek out craft where you wouldn't necessarily expect to find it. And almost all of them feel obliged to cast doubt on the virtues that we tend to associate with craft. For example, its ethical superiority or its authenticity. And these deconstructive instincts play out in many different geographical and chronological situations. I'm just going to focus on one, New York City in the 1930s, which was the setting for 2 of my favorite recent articles in the journal. The first I'll tell you about is by Ezra Shales, there in row 2, who examined the Empire State Building as a handmade object, and you'll again hear from him tomorrow as well. So Ezra points out that the Empire State Building, this skyscraper, was assembled and finished almost entirely by hand by hundreds of skilled specialist craftsmen. Moreover, that these workers were not ignored, but celebrated in their own time, in the press, in official statements by the concerns that were behind the skyscraper financially, also by Alfred E. Smith, the governor of New York at the time, who had been a bricklayer in his own earlier years, and he presented the skyscraper as an example of fine workmanship, partly to position himself favorably within the politics of the time, for example, in relation to labor unions. Now, across town at the same time, to look at another article by Victoria Kane, the Natural History Museum was launching its own press campaign, promoting itself through fascinating images of craft in action. So Victoria took as her evidence these amazing photographs of the preparators who made the famous natural history dioramas at the museum. These images projected an image of scientific but also artisanal know-how. And in this case, fascinatingly, it was the spectacle of inauthenticity that made such good theater. Now, neither the Empire State Building nor a natural history diorama conform to usual expectations of what we mean when we say craft, or modern craft, even. But it seems to me that such case studies absolutely do fit the bill, and in fact, they help to define that terrain in a more open way. They broaden our conception of how craft operates in the culture. And the fact that both Shales and Kane are writing about the 1930s, the period wedged between the arts and crafts movement and the emergence of studio craft in the post-war era, and also in America's largest, most booming city rather than in some pastoral village. I think that's equally interesting. Craft seems to retain its rhetorical power and its effectiveness alike, no matter what the location. Despite its reputation for stasis and traditionalism, in fact, it's constantly shifting. You never know where you'll encounter it next. So articles like these and many others in the journal chart what I would call an expanded field of craft, in which it is manifestly not inferior, nor even necessarily artistic, but rather is a simple fact of modern life. And you could say that this is the real story of craft in the 20th century, the hidden story. As the caption here puts it again from Ezra's article, the artisans are dead, but here are the new artisans on building sites. And of course, they're also in industry. They're in the preparatory stages of medicine and design and engineering and in a host of other disciplines. Ironically, these are the areas where the American Craft Council and its kindred organizations had made few alliances in the 20th century until very, very recently. And the same, in fact, could be said for the Renwick. I think this is probably the first show where these other kinds of craft, high-tech, industrial artisanry, fashion design, and so forth, where those really are included in a kind of level playing field within an exhibition at the Renwick, and it's still vanishingly rare. Why did this happen? Well, there were good reasons. Industrial artisans like these, the craft movements, tended to consider as alienated and lacking in individual freedom, so they were sunk in some form of capitalist oppression. Amateurs, another key area of craft practice, much in our minds today, the craft movements of the 20th century tended to see quite simply as beneath them. I think there was a great concern on the part of the studio craft movement in particular that they would be mistaken for amateurs, trapped in their own obsessions, lacking in sufficient artistic vision. What about craftspeople working for tourist markets? Here, another example from the journal, image taken in Kenya of some carvers who invented a new craft, working coconuts, the only available raw material on the island of Lamu off the coast of Kenya. Why? Because they had lots of tourists coming for the beaches and nothing to sell them. So they invented this traditional craft, and now people assume that when they buy a bracelet or a bowl made of coconut shell, they're getting an ancient African craft object. After all, it's Africa, so it must have always been there, right? But in fact, it's from the 1970s. And the guy in the middle, whose name is Marage, is nicknamed the cleverest of the clever by his colleagues for having come up with this. So how did the craft movements consider these tourist craftspeople? Well, of course, they considered them to be completely ersatz, purveyors of inauthentic kitsch, something to struggle against, for example, through the instrument of the World Crafts Council, founded in 1964. What about the luxury industry, which, as we all know, if we think about it, is one of the greatest repositories of high levels of craft skill in the world? Well, the studio movement saw the luxury industry as aesthetically and also quite possibly morally bankrupt, which I might add is a view that's perhaps shared by many in this room. But there you have the skilled workers, nonetheless. In contrast to these other examples, there's also the hidden engine room of the art world, the fabrication shop, which was not disdained by the crafts movements, but was simply offstage and inaccessible to them. Fabricators created the minimalist and pop sculpture of the 60s, and today make the works of art stars like Jeff Koons and Rachel White-Reed and Mark Quinn. But they are secretive places where a great deal of capital is concentrated in skilled hands, yes, and this is the real story of art in relation to craft, you could argue, not the fraudulent story that we've been given as if there were some sort of categorical boundaries that could be blurred, and as if that were meaningful. This is the story of craft in the art world. But the fabrication business seems to be well beyond the craft world's reach, behind a veil of secrecy and proprietary knowledge, and business deals for that matter. So articles like these, and many others in the journal, chart this expanded field of craft, in which is manifestly not inferior, nor, oh sorry, I'm onto the wrong page there. So, taking such areas seriously as modern craft has been a central goal for the journal. For me personally, it has taken me way out of my comfort zone as a trained art historian. It's taken me to the terrains of anthropology, social history, economic analysis. It seems to me that this broadening of view is the most momentous thing to happen in craft studies since I've been involved with it. It's exciting partly because it gives us license to pursue our subject wherever we want and to discover just how big the horizons of craft are. But there's also a big problem that accompanies this change of perspective, this broadening of perspective. If we're now aware of the prevalence and persistence of craft in all of these different situations and many others besides, then what exactly are we fighting for? What is the project? What is the project? What is our project when the other kids are already singing around the tree? When craft is not only fashionable, but is recognized as lying at the discursive center of art, design, and industry, past and present. And my answer, again, a personal one, but which I offer as a suggestion for more general reflection, is to say goodbye. I've thought about this a lot, and I've decided that this is the last public talk I'm going to be giving about craft, at least for a while. And The Invention of Craft, which I mentioned earlier, will also be the last book I write with craft in the title, at least for a while. Why? Well, partly it's a fear of repeating myself. Maybe there's a bit of a fear of saturating the audience of available listeners and readers. It's curiosity about other things, of course, things that can't be effectively approached through craft, at least not as the principal concern. But I think the most important thing for me is that my original motivations for thinking about this at all seem to have become historical. Now, I'm not going to be going cold turkey entirely. For example, I'm still helping to edit the Journal of Modern Craft, so keep sending me your articles. And I'll still work with students and colleagues. I'll still avidly follow the scene, if it can be called a scene anymore, which I very much doubt. But I think that for me, it's really time to talk about something else and think about something else. Now, by this, I certainly don't mean that I want to replay the departures that have shaped craft history up until now. Ever since the mid-19th century, successive generations of ceramists, weavers, glass blowers, etc. have tried to present themselves as artists, and this is a story you'll all know. So when they've said goodbye craft, what they've implicitly meant is good riddance too. So we all know this story, the story of makers like Peter Voulkos, who tried to transcend the world of craft, seeing it as too limiting, too parochial. This is a story I told in Thinking Through Craft, and there I pointed out that such a departure could at best be only partial, because it would likely, and I think this is very true of Voulkos, it would likely depend on a simple negation or inversion of an existing set of craft values. For example, Voulkos's work strategically inverted normative features of pottery, offering solid mass instead of hollow volume, asymmetry instead of balance, matte acrylic paint instead of translucent glaze, and so on. So he's taking craft and he's just turning it upside down. And in such an instance, saying goodbye is purportedly a launch pad into a supposedly more artistically valid endeavor, but in fact what it does is simply to crystallize the existing power structure and reconfirm it. And that's certainly not the kind of farewell I have in mind. Nor do I want to emulate the earlier set of departures which I describe in my new book, The Invention of Craft. The 19th century apologists of the factory system issued their own goodbye to craft, rejecting artisanal knowledge as a backward, inefficient precursor to more systematic, automated, and effective ways of doing things, a way in which workers could be treated just like any other moving part in the factory. This set up a clear opposition between the hand and the machine. And here again we see this structure of inversion, because later in the century, theorists like Ruskin and Morris would simply turn that idea upside down. So instead of preferring efficiency, they would prefer inefficiency, for example. Instead of preferring predictability, they would prefer surprise, incident. But what's interesting, and what my book really tries to discuss, is that this conceptual structure was invented long before Ruskin and Morris came on the scene. It was invented by people that you probably haven't even heard of. For example, the physician Andrew Ure, who's best remembered today for his 1835 book, The Philosophy of Manufactures, and also remembered for the fact that Karl Marx spends much of his great magnum opus Capital using Andrew Ure as a kind of punching bag. so he kind of appears as a cartoon cutout villain throughout Capital. But to many others, he was a hero, a kind of paladin of modern industry. He helped to found what's called the Mechanics Institute movement, training generations of Scottish mechanics in the theory of and practice of machine work. So for example, if you were a machine tool maker, he would try to teach you physics. He also wrote long treatises, including The Philosophy of Manufactures, which described the productive processes of his day in minute detail. But what's important about him, for our perspective, is that in these texts, he could not have been more explicit in relegating what he called handicraft operations to the dustbin of history. So he would describe them, for example, as capricious and hardly susceptible of scientific investigation. So he simply wouldn't talk about them. So accustomed are we to thinking of craft in this way, albeit usually using positive terms such as flexible, individualistic, or tacit, let's say, that it's quite easy to miss the novelty of the distinction that Ure is drawing. Craft is being invented in texts like this one, but it's being invented in the negative. It's created as the mirror image of progress. And as I say, before this happens, you don't have it as a conceptual framework. It's not a way of organizing thought about production. Perhaps the most brutal and disturbing application of this set of ideas was in colonial contexts. I'll just use the example of India, where you had self-appointed improvers associated with the East India Company looking at works like this one. This is a hand-embroidered textile. I realize it looks mass-produced, but it's actually every stitch for yards and yards and yards is hand-embroidered with absolute regularity. Or this ebony cradle with its astonishing regularity of turnings and carved ornament. They would look at objects like this and conclude that they must have been made by people who were subhuman. Why? Because nobody who was fully human could bear to do it. And so they positioned craft not only as inferior, racially inferior, but also as static, resistant to forward change, again, the opposite of progress, and also as feminine. And this is a story that we'll be familiar with also in terms of domestic crafts, for example, the accomplishments that ladies were expected to learn in the 18th and 19th century to prove their marriageability. But all of these different frameworks of the superiority of Western, masculine, factory-based mass production culture were set up and defined and, as I say, invented precisely in relation to an equally novel, equally invented construct of craft. And what's very important to observe from this set of dynamics is that this is the framework that we still live within. So that when you encounter a craft-made object and you celebrate it for its irregularity or its traditionalism or its individual expression, its superiority, or in a way kind of countercultural integrity in relationship to something mass-produced, you were thinking within a framework that was set up by colonial powers. You were thinking within a framework that was set up by factory apologists. And frankly, that's not a framework that I feel comfortable operating in. And that is why this expanded field of craft is so important. It's not simply a matter of chasing the subject wherever it will run. It's a matter of getting over a rigid hierarchy in which even the supporters of craft have repeated the dynamics of inferiority that were constructed atop the skilled hands of the worker. Now, of course, even back in the 19th century, this structure, this conceptual structure in which industry and craft were opposed, missed something big, which is that artisans were not, in fact, made obsolete by mass production, nor were they even oppositional to it, really. This was entirely rhetorical, you could say. In fact, in the early 19th century, during the heyday of the Industrial Revolution, skills actually were becoming more and more important than ever before, because it was skilled hands that made the machine tools that made the goods, skilled hands that made the patterns that would be reproduced, skilled hands that kept the tools in running order, and in many cases also skilled hands that finished the articles as they came off the machines, because the machines weren't capable of achieving the requisite quality. And it's fascinating to consider that somebody that makes a machine tool by hand actually has much more economic power and consequence than somebody that makes objects one by one, because if they make that thing well, then it will go on to make possible the creation of many, many more objects. And all of that is going to depend on craftsmanship. So although we tend to think of the 19th century as a great period of decline in craft, in fact, it was the exact opposite. There were undoubtedly more skilled workers in Britain in 1850 than in 1750, and more was riding on their work, economically speaking. And this will be true anywhere that you see a process of early industrialization. So I'm thinking here not only of machine tool builders, mechanics, factory engineers, but also shipwrights, bridge riveters, builders, carriage makers, on and on. What these hands lacked was not skill, as anyone who's ever tried to rivet a bridge together can tell you, but rather, of course, what they lacked was autonomy. And that was precisely the point that William Morris focused on. But again, interestingly, he neglected to consider the primary mechanism which was intended to achieve artisanal autonomy in the 19th century, which of course was the organized labor movement, not the arts and crafts movement. So here I'm showing you the emblem of the Amalgamated Society of Engineers, which sounds very boring, but actually this is the first mega union. So it was a gathering together of a great number of different mechanic society for the purposes of greater political power. The idea was that you could band together, and so for example, if workers went out on strike in Manchester, they would also do it in Sheffield and London, and so they would exert a lot more pressure on the managers and the capitalists. So this was a nightmare for the people running the factories, that workers would not willingly act their part in the great machine of industry, but would apply friction to the churning wheels of progress. Now, the unions were anything but regressive, anything but attached to tradition. As you can see in the emblem, which was designed in 1851 by James Sharples, who himself was an industrial iron worker and also a self-taught engraver, the image presents skilled workers within a harmonious palace of productivity, connected to shipping on the right and the train coming in on the left, for example, so fully part of the economy. And the same artist, James Sharples, created this lovingly made depiction of a forge at about the same time, 1851, same year as the Crystal Palace exhibition in Hyde Park. So here you can see a similarly harmonious world of labor. The image is unusual, if not unique, as a representation of a Victorian industrial workshop by an artisan who actually worked in one. So this is Sharples showing you his own workspace, which, as I say, is probably unique. I've never found another example. And he carefully renders the architecture of the space, the world of tools that it contains, and the dress and bearing of the workers. It's a scene, again, of professional interdependency in which labor is clearly divided into discrete tasks according to skill level. So the hierarchy is spelled out in a progression from left to right. First you have the unskilled apprentice who stokes the forge fire, his face directly in the flames, obviously very unpleasant and probably very low paid. Then you have these two figures, probably journeymen, who are manipulating this very heavy pipe, semi-skilled workers probably. And then you have the shop foreman here, who directs the activity by pointing into the background. Now he's not the manager, he's an artisan. How do we know? Because he's wearing this leather apron, and in a wonderful detail, I'm not sure if you can tell, but it's worn at its edges, which indicates, again, his long experience in the trade. So this image uses the tools of visual narrative very subtly to convey the same themes as Sharples' emblem for the Amalgamated Society of Engineers. All the workers are in their rightful place according to their skill. So these men don't seem to feel alienated, and they also clearly have no desire to say goodbye to craft, which is, after all, their stock in trade. But this brings me back to Morris again, and this other type of goodbye, this other type of departure, which was issued by the arts and crafts movement. And maybe this is not so much a saying farewell as it is a plaintive narrative of loss, which is typically accompanied by a call for preservation and revival. Morris and his colleagues, fired by the spirit of socialism, nonetheless had no time for the organized labor movement because they saw it as accommodationist. In other words, they were too utopian, too radical in their political goals to see big labor as being consistent with their valuation of craft skill. And that's another story we don't really have time for, but an important one about the separation of the politics of skill on the one hand, the unions, from the symbolic use of craft in an aesthetic register on the other. And I think it's interesting to note the complete lack of contact between labor unions and the craft movements in the 20th century, and even still today. Almost no connection whatsoever, again with a few important recent exceptions. This divorce renders the arts and crafts movement, in my mind, no less problematic than the rationalizations of Andrew Ewer or the status consciousness of Volkus. And again, it's worth emphasizing the repetition of this idea of loss, which I mentioned before. All the way back in 1929, Thomas Carlyle had written, "On every hand, the living artisan is driven from his workshop to make room for the speedier, inanimate one. The shuttle drops from the fingers of the weaver and falls into iron fingers that ply it faster." And then a century later, after Carlyle was writing, a man named George Sturt wrote about the craft of the wheelwright, which had remained intact, he said, since the days of the Canterbury Tales, but seemed to be vanishing from the face of the earth. And then when I went onto the TV show that I told you about, Handmade Revolution, I encountered a wheelwright who told me exactly the same story, that he was the last in the line. By the way, there's another wheelwright who lives around the corner from me in London. He still serves the local vegetable markets, which like this old-fashioned look because it attracts tourists. So this is the most powerful and paradoxical idea about craft that has come down to us from the moment of its invention. Craft was created as an absence. It came into being as a figure of cancellation, an X marking a spot that had never existed in the first place. This Proustian image of craft as a memory that haunts the present is an inextricable aspect of its cultural power. Craft simultaneously gives shape to our desire for continuity and reminds us of the actual, tragic discontinuity of our modern experience. Like the involuntary memories of a dimly remembered childhood that trouble Marcel in remembrance of things past, or you could say like a bandage that heals a wound, calls attention to the wound, and hides the wound all at the same time. 200 years, then, in which craft has been constantly shadowed by the sense of an ending. But obviously craft has not gone away as a result of these various departures. Craft was, as I've been saying, a modern invention, and it has drawn much of its cultural power from the sense of urgency that is enacted through these various forms of farewell. So what sort of departure would fit our own times? Once we're aware of this history, what sort of goodbye can we offer to craft? Can I offer to craft? Well, Andrew Ewer thought craft was too slow and needed to be made efficient. William Morris thought craft was too fragile and needed protection. Peter Volkus thought it was too parochial and needed to be left behind altogether. I feel the opposite. I feel that I can say goodbye to craft after all these years because it is so strong, so fast-moving, so pervasive, permanent, and multiple. The power of craft is all around us for all to see. It doesn't really need help. It's on reality television shows, the one I was on, or this example, Timber Sports, which pits woodsmen from tree-rich nations like New Zealand and Canada against one another in the fine arts of tree chopping. At the other end of the gender scale, it was at the royal wedding in London in April 2011, designed by Sarah Burton, who took over as the head of the fashion house of Alexander McQueen after his tragic suicide. The dress worn by Kate Middleton, now the Duchess of Cambridge, featured lacework made by the Royal School of Needlework. The lace was largely executed in the Carrick-Macross applique technique, which was invented in the 19th century. And this is something I write about in the book. It was actually a way of keeping starving girls employed during the Irish potato famine. And effectively, these were sweatshops, but then the lace was bought by generous ladies in England as a kind of charitable exercise to keep alive the poor Irish. Now, to my knowledge, no media commentator has mentioned that in relation to Kate Middleton's dress, but it's only one aspect of an outfit that explicitly evokes a multi-layered past, a British past, with its Victorian corset, its bustle, its tiara dating from 1936, and inevitably its echo of another royal wedding exactly 30 years earlier. In true Proustian manner, the dress functioned as the locus for a giant spectacle of national sentiment, a marker of past sorrow and present-day healing, almost, you could say, the lifting of a curse. Anyone thinking that craft is threatened or going away in the 21st century should reflect on the fact that such a dress, viewed and adored by millions, capable of making many of them burst into tears, could only ever have been handmade. In the face of such narratives, it does seem to me time to say goodbye to craft, at least in this sense. We should stop worrying about it as a field. Craft does not need to be a constituency or a cause, a project or a mission. Let's have the courage to say that it will not disappear, that craft is not an endangered species, that it's powerful. Yes, I know there are problems, and we need to think about them. People don't learn skills by magic or by downloading them from the internet, for example, and that's something that every educator needs to bear in mind. There's also the simple fact of difficulty that always arises when you want to make something well. And given that there's a strong temptation to move laterally across disciplines, and that every maker knows that if they want to, they can take on something completely new, some new process, some new material, some new tool in the studio every morning, this problem of difficulty has never been more important and provocative. Also, individual institutions like the Renwick and its many sibling museums across the country and the world must contend with the new transdisciplinary environment, and this is not easy. I said at the beginning that 40 under 40 is a very rare thing, and I think partly that's because it was curated by Nicholas and his colleagues in a spirit of absolute confidence, and also a lack of defensiveness and a spirit of openness. So we need more shows like this, more uncategorizable makers like those assembled in the galleries down the street. But you know what? I have no doubt that this will in fact happen, just as I know that my own trade of craft history and theory has found many new and exciting voices in recent years, many of us in the room, and will continue to in years to come. For my own part, I have a new project on the books. It's an exhibition which, if all goes well, will open the new galleries that we're building at the V&A in late 2016. So this is an exhibition called The Future, A History. And the premise of it is to present the V&A's collection in the future tense. So it begins with medieval images of the Last Judgment. So it starts with the end of the world, you might say. And it carries forward to the present, always showing what the world might look like, but then giving a retrospective view onto those prophetic images. So the visionary architecture of the Enlightenment, for example, or this is a wonderful example, an image drawn in 1851, again, showing what clothing might look like in 1951. Also, the 20th century's romance with science fiction and the close relationship that futuristic films and literature had to contemporaneous industrial design. And then finally to the present day, a time when we seem to live in the future almost more than the present, constantly held as we are on the edge of calamity and possibility, surrounded by forecasts. Now clearly this is not a craft exhibition, but it almost goes without saying that in navigating the waters of the future, past and present, I'll be relying on everything I have learned by studying craft's temporalities, its peculiar way of moving forward by reverting to the past. I'll be drawing on some of the utopian thinking that has characterized craft discourse, Morris's News from Nowhere, after all, perhaps being the greatest futurist novel of the 19th century. And in line with what I've been saying about seeing craft as a potent force for change, I'll also be thinking about the fact that imaginings of the future are almost always handmade and moreover tend to involve a simple displacement of skill. So here you have a very simple example, drawing replaced by a robot arm, but of course the robot arm itself needs to be crafted. So from the fantastical inventions of the Renaissance to the prototypes and renderings of today, we can say that projections of tomorrow are inherently impractical, and they require great skill to bring into being if they are to be convincing. And of course that formula, impracticality allied to skill, is the formula that has long defined modern craft. So as you can see, even as I say goodbye to craft, I continue to see it as the foundation and connective tissue and as a reverberating echo in all my work. Similarly, I would say to all of you who care deeply about craft and its associated virtues, to keep caring, but not by forming a lobby or a pressure group, and not by feeling that you have a private cause to defend, but rather by carrying your skills and insights, whether in making or writing or curating, into new and uncharted waters. For in fact, when all is said and done, neither you nor I can say goodbye to craft entirely, even if we wanted to, any more than we can to our own childhoods. That is the big mistake that so many have made. Architects thinking that they could leave mere building behind, for example, or self-appointed artists wanting to deny the physicality of their own creations. Even when craft isn't center stage, it is there as a necessity, as a means of making the future present. So even as I say goodbye for now, goodbye to craft, I do it in full knowledge that will continue to be my constant companion. So thanks to you all for listening. I wish you an early Merry Christmas, and I know we'll meet again. Thank you. Okay, I've been told that exceptionally I'm going to be allowed to answer questions all by myself. So does anyone have one to start with? Yeah.
Clearly you come from a long liberal tradition and as an intellectual in this current field that you've taken on. If you're rejecting the notion of ideas as the fundamental way you develop your taxonomy of your understanding, taking Morris's bifurcation, for example, what do you replace it with? Where are you going? What is your alternative to ideas as the metric of thought here?
Yes, thanks for that question. I wouldn't say that I'm rejecting ideas, but I would say that I'm rejecting binaries. So there's a very useful, although slightly annoyingly lingo-based distinction that you can make between dialectical thinking and dialogical thinking. Dialectics being sort of A versus B, crashing together, fighting it out, kind of like an American election. Dialogics is more like a conversation in a room, multivariable. And so my model of craft would not be hand versus machine. My model of craft would be look at all the different contexts in which it operates and how different it is in each of those contexts, how implicated it is in so many different situations. Now, that's not a matter of refusing to deal with it in terms of ideas or even in terms of ideology. So I'm not rejecting a political stance in relation to craft. What I'm rejecting is a, let's say, a manifesto-driven political stance that holds that craft is always good, no matter what. Gabriel.
Yeah, in that dialogical conversation, you know, I'm trying to compose this question. I've had 2 weeks to think about this after seeing your lecture in Berkeley. But, you know, I think I understand a little bit better what you're saying about the unnecessity of having a constituency. But then I think the thing that I get stuck on is the people that are part of that constituency self-identify as craftspeople. Mm-hmm. Then as we see craft all around us, I absolutely see craft everywhere I look, projecting that identity onto people who don't self-identify with craft. Mm-hmm. It seems problematic to me because we're defining their identity for them, possibly unwantedly, and then at that point I'm afraid that we can end up othering people, and I think that I would just love to hear what you would think of that situation.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that the question of the self-identified craftsperson is not actually very different from the position of a self-identified craft museum, like the Renwick, because you have this set of expectations about ownership and also about expertise. And in the case of a craftsperson, for sure, and often in the case of a curator or a specialist or scholar, as I've been saying about myself, it's also a matter of years and years of exposure. So it's a life, you know, it runs very, very deep. So what would it mean to throw all of that into doubt? Well, I think for me, it's primarily a case of not feeling like one's ownership over craft is privileged over others. So I have no problem with people calling themselves craftspeople, or indeed potters or weavers or craft curators. And I would look back at the last 20 years of my growing relationship with craft with a lot of pride. And certainly I still would consider myself to be a craft specialist in some sense. But I think the key thing there is not to mistake long experience and commitment for superiority. We've all had the experience of having a 5-year-old tell us something that we should have thought of 10 years ago. And I think that your use of the term othering is absolutely right on, because to me, it's about realizing that craft, insofar as it is pervasive and also extremely potent and powerful and to be watched and suspected in some cases, it's a matter of realizing that any position that one takes on the subject is culturally specific and therefore has to be open to doubt. So yes to commitment, yes to experience and expertise, yes to life that's filled with craft, but no to absolute certainties about whether that makes you better than someone else or having a better perspective than someone else.
Well, I guess the second part of the question was really about projecting identity onto people who don't want that identity. And I think that that's the one thing that I find problematic, because I want to see craft everywhere. But when I see it everywhere and I say, hey, look, that's craft, and the person says, wait a second, I'm a bridge builder, I'm not a craftsperson. What do we do with that?
Did everyone hear that question? So it's about projecting craft onto people that don't really want the term. It happens all the time in the art world too. If you call, Grayson Perry a craftsperson, you're gonna have to brace yourself at least for a long discussion, and other people will respond less thoughtfully than that. My feeling is that, for one thing, that is going away, and that's, I think, implicit in what I've been saying, that the fashionability of craft is one reason that I feel less motivated or charged to deal with it, because I felt much more like that was the case 20 years ago than I do now. And I suppose the other thing is that there are ways to appreciate and value someone's craftsmanship without having to agree on terms with them. Obviously that, this asymmetry is very, very, very deep in modern culture, and it's not just going to go away because we've all pointed it out to one another. But I think it's also possible to have a very flexible and observant relationship to craft rather than a sort of we're either in it together or not. Ezra.
Thanks for the talk, and I did blush when you put me up there. Glenn's a great editor too, so if you ever get the chance, it's he makes you look better on page as well as on screen. Just to kind of play around, you went on this kind of trajectory, and then you kind of headed off at a certain point with Morris. And in some ways, I'd say, okay, you're tabling the kind of the colonial power relationship that is buried. It's the 7/8 of the iceberg that's invisible when we talk about the object as unique, handmade, wonderfully eccentric, and from some marginal person. But on the other hand, when you go and we're talking about Morris, and then you mentioned that he could not resolve his issues with the amalgamated society of engineers, millwrights, whatever it was. So at that point, you could say, okay, we actually still need this dialectical argument based on class and the suppression of class in the discourse of craft. So, my argument tomorrow in a nutshell will be that, okay, why do Morris and Gropius call themselves masters of guilds? There's a power relationship there. And when you look at most museums today, that power relationship seems still worth asking and pursuing. Does it not? For an example, it was only, the counter space show at MoMA. Might be a weird example. In it, when MoMA acquired this kitchen designed by Greta Schutlahotsky, it's the earliest work acquired by a woman now. And it's only a year ago, right? Which is remarkable if you think. the earliest object in MoMA's collection made by a woman designer. In that exhibition, there were many crafted objects, there were many designers mentioned, but the fact that the anonymous object made by a lower class person perhaps, doesn't quite make it into our craft shows, doesn't quite make it into our art shows or design shows, except 100 years later. So isn't that dialectical issue of class still worth pursuing in order to name the objects that are in the show?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to take all of that question on. Maybe I'll just say...
The issue of class, doesn't that make it an imperative still to talk about this? And actually, and you like to think you can talk about that in a dialogic space, but often we can't when the balance of you know, $1 million objects to $5 objects is so unweighted, imbalanced.
So there's just two things I'll say. First of all, I think there is still an ongoing responsibility to deal historically with the past of modern material culture, which indeed does continue in many ways today, in which these asymmetries were absolutely formative and structured what was happening. So when you go back to look at the Frankfurt kitchen that you mentioned that MoMA collected from the 1920s, or you look at a piece of Victorian furniture, it's very, very helpful to know that those asymmetries prevailed, and that if you are going to retrospectively characterize them, then you really do need to use these categories because those are the ones that were active at the time. That's quite different from going forward. I mean, we're talking about craft futures here, right, Nicholas? And what I'm calling for is a kind of post-categorical engagement with future possibilities, but I don't certainly mean that we should be blind to the, let's say, the class conflict that's embedded in handmade or machine-made objects in the past. So that's one thing to say. I suppose the other thing to say is that, you know, if you're trying to get a handle on what the problem is between the labor unions and William Morris, it's quite useful to think the labor unions were always pushing for a shorter day, and William Morris was always talking about joy and labor. And there you kind of have it in a nutshell, you know. And I think that what that exposes is that even in a very rigid understanding of class structure, where you have an aristocracy and a bourgeoisie and then a working class, which is itself divided hierarchically according to skill level, as I was talking about earlier, you can have a lot of debate around the question of class identity and labor as action. And you don't have to be a professional Marxist philosopher to be able to get involved with that, I think. You know, you can simply be a maker and think about what the real value of your making is, not because you have an ideological description of it, but because of what it actually does in terms of changing the world around you. And that's precisely I mean, Gabriel's a great example of this. That's precisely the way that younger makers tend to think about what they're doing. It's about real relationships in real time and real space rather than about theoretical consequences, you could say.
But just to, I know Nicholas wants me to shut up, but, and rightly so, but my argument would be that, you know, to pretend we live in a post-categorical phase is similar to pretending we live in a post-class phase or in a classless society.
Yeah.
That's the danger, as far as I...
Yeah, I mean, ultimately what I'm saying today is about what we should strive for. That's the last thing I'll say. Thanks.
I know that if we dissect everything that Glenn said today, that he'll never actually be able to say goodbye to the field, because there's so much that came out of that talk. Glenn, on behalf of a heavily invested audience, an audience that knows this field and loves this field, let's thank you for everything that you've done over the last many, many years. Thank you. I know that was hard to say. I know it was also hard for some of us to hear, but I think it was absolutely necessary. And it will give us food for thought for a long time to come. All right, what? 10 minutes? Okay, we have 10 minutes. Then we're coming back to listen to our good friends Liz, to Ulysses, to Jen, and to Julie talk about many of the values that Glenn was just talking about and how they are engaged in public institutional spaces. Come back at 2 o'clock, please.